Good evening. My name is Beth Bilson, and I am at the end of my first day as acting dean of the College of Law. And it was a surprise to me, too. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 17th, and it's hard to believe it's the 17th annual Saskatchewan Law Review Lecture, which is part of the newly established McKercher LLP lecture series at the College of Law. The McKercher law firm has had a very long and constructive relationship with the college, and they have now generously agreed to sponsor our lecture series for the next 3 years, which allows the college to continue to present a wide range of informative, educational, and entertaining speakers to the law school community and to the public. McKercher is, by Saskatchewan standards, a large law firm. It has offices in Saskatoon and Regina and offers a full range of legal services to clients. It was recently ranked a top law firm in Saskatchewan by Canadian Lawyer magazine in 2013. And in September of 2014, just a few weeks ago, McKercher LLP was awarded the Canadian National Pro Bono Law Firm Award at the 5th National Pro Bono Law Conference in Regina. And this award recognizes a Canadian law firm that has made an outstanding contribution to the provision of pro bono legal services. McKercher has a long history of commitment to pro bono services in the community, working to help deliver legal assistance to remote areas of Saskatchewan where individuals can't access legal services, and allowing their articling students to fill in for law students who would normally assist at classic Saskatoon's inner city legal clinic. And now a word about the Saskatchewan Law Review, which is a peer-reviewed publication that published its first volume in 1936, and it's now published semi-annually by the College of Law under the authority of the University of Saskatchewan. Currently, the Law Review has about 1,800 subscribers, including both practicing and academic members of the legal profession, as well as libraries in Canada and other countries. The Law Review provides a vehicle for peer-reviewed articles and comments authored by practicing and academic members of the legal profession and by law students and other people who are interested in analyzing subject matter of concern to lawyers. Each year, one of the projects of the Saskatchewan Law Review, which is managed in large part by students in the College of Law, is to host a lecture. And this year, we're happy to welcome Andrew Coyne, who is the National Affairs columnist for Post Media News, as our guest speaker. Now, you probably thought Andrew Coyne's head was this big, because I'm sure you're used to seeing him with your cornflakes every morning in the Star Phoenix. Mr. Coyne was raised in Winnipeg, and at the dinner that preceded this lecture, he was very adamant that he doesn't come from Toronto, although he lives in Toronto. He's a graduate of the University of Toronto and the London School of Economics, and he's written for a wide variety of publications: Maclean's, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Time, Saturday Night, and the Walrus, to name a few. Those of you who are fans of the At Issue panel on the CBC have probably seen him quite often as well. He's the winner of 2 national newspaper awards and the Hyman Solomon Award for Excellence in Public Policy Journalism. He's a fellow of the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Andrew Coyne.
Well, thank you very much, Acting Dean Bilson. And thank you, former Dean. And thank you, everyone, for coming out. It's a great honor to be asked to give this talk, and I was familiarizing myself during dinner with the work of the Law Review, and it really does sound like quite a prestigious organization, so I'm more than honored and happy to be associated with it, and I hope I can do justice to the time that you're granting me. The title of my address, Our Broken Democracy, may strike some of you as provocative. If anything, I'm here to tell you I think that's maybe a little bit of an understatement. We're accustomed to thinking of change for good or ill in incremental terms. Things get a little bit better, things get a little bit worse. And I don't mean to suggest that some sort of sudden crisis has overtaken us. The decline of our democracy has been in the works for decades. But I do think we have tripped some kind of wire in recent years. No democracy is perfect. People in every country complain about the faults in theirs. But somewhere along the way, I believe ours crossed the line. Put plainly, we no longer live under the system we think we do. We have the form of a parliamentary democracy, but not the substance. No, we have not become a tyranny. We do not fear the midnight knock on our door. But if government is not our master in this country, neither is it wholly our servant. We have not become a dictatorship, but we are no longer quite a democracy, not in any meaningful sense. At least that's what I'll try to argue tonight. Some of the problems with our system are long-standing and well-known. Others are of more recent vintage, and while any of them on its own might not on its own trouble us unduly, their accumulated weight should, not least because each new abuse, each further assault on our democratic rights and prerogatives only weakens our defenses to resist the next. The failings are profound and across the board, from the conduct of our elections to how we count the votes to the way that Parliament works or doesn't work. We should beware, of course, of falsely idealizing how politics used to be in this country. There never was any good old days when everything was Jeffersonian democracy, as the Americans would say. But we should equally steer clear of the lazy assumption that it's always been this way. It hasn't. It's worse now, clearly, markedly worse. This is not a commentary on recent political controversies necessarily, or an indictment of any one party. The dismantling of Canadian democracy is a glittering bipartisan achievement. And while I will spend most of my time talking about the federal domain, much of what follows applies equally to provincial politics, though of course I except Saskatchewan from that. So allow me, if you will, to raise the alarm gently at the state of our broken democracy. Let's start with a pretty clear warning signal: voter turnout. Turnout in federal elections has been on the decline for more than 20 years. In the 16 elections from 1945 to 1993, turnout averaged nearly 75%. In the 6 elections since then, it has averaged just 62%. But that's of registered voters, that is, of the names Elections Canada maintains on its permanent voter list. Throw in those who registered on election day, or those who never registered at all, and the reality is that barely half the voting age population casts their ballot, and that's federally. At the provincial level, typically you might get 40 to 45%. In some municipalities, we're looking at 30% or less. We can't be sure of the reasons for this, of course, and other countries have also experienced declines in turnout. But if I had to speculate, and after all, speculating is what I do for a living, well, I wonder. When the prospective voter looks at the candidates in his or her riding, what does he see? He sees nominations that are often secured at meetings stacked with busloads of instant members, their memberships purchased for them, with rival candidates finding their cars blocked from parking and other dirty tricks. That's if the local race is not a complete sham, the selection having already been effectively made by the party leader, although, of course, in every case, the candidate is utterly dependent on the leader's approval, since without the leader's signature on his nomination papers, he cannot run. Perhaps the voter is interested in where the candidates stand on the issues. But it doesn't really matter where the candidates stand because all policy is set by the parties. And it doesn't matter where the parties stand because at any given time they generally stand for the same thing, and because whatever they stand for today, they will stand for its opposite tomorrow. When the voter watches the election campaign, what does he see? He sees campaigns dominated by attack ads, photo ops, attack ads, and news coverage heavily focused on polls, gaffes, and inside baseball discussions of strategy, mostly about attack ads. Then the votes are counted, and what does the voter see? He sees a parliament that looks nothing like what the voters cast their ballots for, with a distribution of seats between the parties bearing no resemblance to the division of opinion in the country. He sees that the MP he elects has no real role or responsibility, but to stand up and sit down when he's told. He sees a parliament that collectively has very little ability to hold governments to account. He sees that all power effectively resides in the office of the Prime Minister. In recent years, he's seen parties and leaders not only go back on their word or abandon their long-held convictions, but break their own laws. He's seen MPs being offered government jobs to cross the floor, and governments refusing to acknowledge confidence votes, or proroguing Parliament rather than face one, or defying express orders of Parliament to surrender documents. And every day, he sees a politics dominated by coarseness, cynicism, name-calling, and mindless partisanship. A viciousness made all the more stupefying for the absence of real divisions among the parties. If politics generally can be defined as people behaving badly for good reasons, our politics involves people behaving appallingly for no reason at all. And you ask, why doesn't he vote? Frankly, the only mystery in all this is why so many people still do. Elections about nothing. Parties reduced to leadership cults. The impotence of ordinary MPs, the irrelevance of Parliament, the near absolute powers of the Prime Minister. If we were writing about a third world country with a system like ours, we in my business would be careful to refer to its largely ceremonial Parliament and sham elections. Only force of habit prevents us from applying the same terms here. Do I exaggerate? Well, let's go into some of these issues in more detail, starting with election campaigns. And let's start with the issue that, more than any other, comes up in surveys as the reason people don't vote: trust, or to give it its proper name, lies. Politics has never been noted as a place for unsparing honesty. At best, it consists of telling people what they want to hear. It deals in shades of truth, selective facts, exaggeration, blarney, and spin. But in most places, at most times, it has been expected that politicians will stay within some sort of limits. As a friend of mine likes to say, there's lies and then there's lies. If you wish to deceive, do so by the sly omission, the evasive answer, the non-denial denial. Equivocate if you can, mislead if you must, but don't say straight up, without room for ambiguity, in a manner that is intended to be believed, something that you know is plainly false. But somewhere along the way, that taboo was broken in Canada, and nowhere more so than in that most fundamental unit of democratic currency, the campaign promise. Perhaps it began with Pierre Trudeau, who campaigned furiously against wage and price controls in the 1974 election, that famous "Zap, you're frozen," only to introduce them shortly afterward. There followed Brian Mulroney, who unctuously upbraided John Turner for his patronage sins as if he were not about himself to take the practice to new depths or heights, depending on your point of view. Jean Chrétien, who promised to abolish the GST and renegotiate NAFTA, but did neither. Stephen Harper, who, having promised he would appoint no one who was not elected to either cabinet or the Senate, on his first day as Prime Minister, appointed his unelected Quebec organizer, Michael Fortier, to both. A pattern that was to be repeated in everything from fixed election dates to the taxation of income trusts, and on and on and on. This is hardly reserved to federal politics. Ontario's Dalton McGuinty signed a promise, I think it was in blood, not to raise taxes without a referendum. New Brunswick's Sean Graham promised not to sell New Brunswick Power. British Columbia's Gordon Campbell disavowed any intent to harmonize the province's sales tax with the federal GST. All of them, once safely elected, proceeded to do or attempt to do the very thing they had promised not to do. Nova Scotia's new Democratic leader, Darrell Dexter, hit for the triple. He promised he would neither raise taxes, cut spending, nor run a deficit, and proceeded to do all three. These were not, it must be stressed, casual slips of the lip, minor items at the bottom of each party's wish list. They were central planks in their platforms, often the major point of divergence between them and their opponents, in some cases arguably the key to their victory. It's not an answer to say you can throw the bums out at the next election, when the question of who said what 4 years ago would have to contend with 40 other rather more current issues. The public should not have to choose between honest government and health care. It should be a given. In any case, the problem is not so much that liars are prospering as that honest politicians have no way of establishing their bona fides anymore. So discredited is the profession generally that everyone is disbelieved equally. This is not, I stress, politics as usual. It's something far worse. It's not just corrosive of public trust, it makes it impossible for the public to have any sense of what it is they're voting on. How can the voters assess even the general direction the candidates would take if they can have no confidence in any particular piece of evidence offered to that effect? A second related issue, almost as certain to depress turnout, indeed calculated to do so, is attack ads, which have become all-pervasive in our campaigns. Those in the game offer two standard defenses for attack ads. One, the other guy started it. You have to understand, people in politics have the moral universe of a 9-year-old. With no offense to any 9-year-olds in the audience, this is invariably true, I should say, in their defense. Whatever sin one party may have committed, it can always find a precedent in its opponents, which is handy since it means neither side need justify its actions in its own right, but only by way of the others. And the second defense, they work. That's the sum of the... It's presented not as an amusing irony, a comment on man's fallen nature, or even a cynical calculation, but I beg you to believe this, as a moral justification. I have heard this offered as, well, they work, so why would you have any problem with them? So often has this been repeated that it's become accepted wisdom. Say what you will about attack ads, my fellow pundits will observe ruefully, but they work. Really? Then why do they have to keep making new ones? Elections generally have losers as well as winners, and I promise you, they all have lots of attack ads. So somebody's ads must not be working. And in fact, I would argue most of them don't. Political parties come up with dozens of ads in the course of a campaign. Some work, most fail. Sometimes they even backfire, seen by the public as so over the top that they redound against their sponsors rather than the intended target. So there's a case to be made against attack ads, but it isn't that they have some kind of awful, talismanic power over us, or that they inevitably tilt the field in favor of one party or another. It's just that they pollute debate. They coarsen the culture. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with politicians criticizing one another, going negative in the vernacular. Politics inevitably involves some mutual criticism, and in fact, it should do so. But it matters how you go about it, whether your aim is to engage the public or to enrage them. Tone matters as much as truth. Truth not merely in the sense of factual accuracy, but fairness, proportion, context. What is objectionable about attack ads is not that they're negative, but that they're corrosive. Corrosive of thought, of truth, of respect for each other or for the voters. Their intent is not to criticize, but to inflame. They're not trying to provoke thought, they're trying to shut it down. The result is not merely to damage one party or the other. The whole profession is degraded to the point that people tune out of politics altogether. The comparison has been made many times before. If the airlines ran attack ads savaging each other's safety records, nobody would fly on any of them. Indeed, politics looks very much like an industry in decline. Not only has the market for politics overall been dwindling, recall those turnout numbers, but so is the share going to the leading players. A generation ago, the winning party in an election, conservative or liberal, could consistently persuade 30 to 40% of the voting age population, sometimes even more, to come out to vote for it. In recent elections, that has fallen to closer to 20%. 1 in 5. That's a mandate nowadays. If any normal industry were experiencing this sort of catastrophic decline, they'd be turning themselves inside out, trying to figure out what they were doing wrong. Only in politics would such a galloping disaster be treated as business as usual. Of course, it's not all darkness and rain in the modern campaign. There's always those signature events, the televised leaders' debates. There is something ludicrous, just a little bit disturbing about deciding an election, not even on the basis of what was learned in the brief chaos of a 5-week campaign, but purely on the strength of who won or lost on a single night as determined by those peerless arbiters, the media. We are electing a government, not a high school debating champion. Don't get me wrong. Debates can be valuable opportunities to compare and contrast the leaders and their platforms. Each of the leaders gets the chance to probe the other's weaknesses, while the public is granted an extended period of close-up scrutiny of the candidates in a spontaneous setting. And we can sometimes learn a great deal about them. But that's a very different thing than what the debates have become more typically, which is simply a prize fight. The candidates are encouraged to shout over each other, to go toe-to-toe, to mix it up, among other boxing metaphors, in hopes of that holy grail of media moments, the knockout blow. Now, one thing I should say about knockout blows, there's almost never in any debate a knockout blow. The only knockout blow I can ever recall was 1984, Mulrooney versus Turner. But ever since then, my fellow journalists have been wandering forlornly, searching for a knockout blow, or as Rick Salutin once called it, when journalists, reporters afterwards say there were no knockout blows, what they really mean is there were no usable clips. But it feeds the media's appetite for conflict, its addiction to narrative. It has no other real use. 5 leaders, 4 subjects, 3 pundits, and a moderator shouting over each other for minutes on end. Why have the debates so full of promise become such wastes of time? Because we've left the design of them to the last-minute ad hoc negotiations between the networks and the parties who, if you've noticed, have vested interests, every one of them. The party ahead in the polls wants to have none. The party behind in the polls wants to have 6. They saw it off at 1, that the networks are desperate to get over with so they can get back to putting on reality shows. Of course, we only have one, I should say one, we have one in each language at the federal level. Now, this curious linguistic segregation observed nowhere else in our national politics in practice means we have one debate for the rest of the country and one whose sole focus is Quebec, let's be frank. So the rest of us watching the French language debate get entertained to long disquisitions on why haven't you funded the Champlain Bridge, or would you get me a job in Saint Maurice? It's so parochial, and I mean this without any slight to the good people of Quebec, but we're supposed to be having a national debate here. We're quite used to simultaneous translation in this country. Why on earth did we put up with this? I alluded earlier to the media's role, and I'd be remiss if I did not dwell on that for a bit. Because we make an invaluable contribution to ruining virtually every election that comes our way. Politicians learn from their mistakes. Sometimes we just go on repeating ours. We can't help ourselves. After every election, we retire defeated to our newsroom postmortems, and each time we vow, never again. Never again will we sit up and beg for our Gainsburgers, the little meaningless morsels of news the parties dole out each day to keep us complicit in their charades. Never again will we chase after every fleeting poll, salivate over every minor gaffe. Never again the gotcha question, the silly photo op, the constant search for defining moments and turning points, the investing of trivial campaign mishaps with metaphoric import. You've seen those, the bus breaks down and the next day's report is, or the next hour's report nowadays is, in a metaphor for a failing campaign. It writes itself. And then we go out and we do it all over again. I don't know whether it's learned behavior or whether it's instinctive, responding to some deeply recessed part of the journalistic brain. I only know that we're hurting democracy. We aren't just missing an opportunity to help the public make sense of things at a critical time. We're making things worse. We're actually getting in the way. The question most readers and television viewers, I submit, or certainly most voters, would like answered in the course of any campaign is, who are these people and what are they going to do to us? Oh, okay, for us. What instead do we in the media tell them? Well, we tell them who's ahead and who's behind. Then we tell them who's ahead and who's behind. After a while, we tell them who's still ahead and who's still behind. Eventually, we descend on whoever's behind and we ask them why they're behind, over and over and over. Why are you behind? Why won't you admit you're behind? Why are you such a loser? If you were a tree, what kind of loser tree would you be? Apparently in the hope that if we keep at it long enough, we might be able to make them cry. When that gets boring, we speculate on whether the ones who are ahead can stay ahead or whether they've peaked too soon, and whatever space we have left, we devote to the strategists. Read the coverage in any major daily on any given day, watch the television. It's not about the election, it's about the campaign. Because in his secret heart of hearts, that's who the journalist wishes he was. One of the players, one of the strategists, one of the guys in the room. We write about the horse race, the polls, the strategy, not because it matters to our readers, but because it matters to the pros, the people we cover, the people we idolize. We parrot their language and we absorb their values, and the modern election coverage is what is the result. But even if we had the most perfect election campaigns imaginable, we would still have to reckon with the carnage wreaked by our antiquated, unrepresentative, divisive electoral system. First past the post, where the plurality, not the majority, wins. Now, I promise you I could spend a whole speech or two on its defects, but just a very quick recap here. Every election throws up fresh anomalies from the first past the post system. For example, in 2006, the NDP with 2.6 million votes got 29 seats. The Bloc Québécois with 1.6 million got 51 seats. The Greens with more than 2/3 of a million votes got 0 seats. Liberals in the West, Tories in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Federalists in Quebec, all greatly underrepresented and distorting our perception of the country as a result, needlessly aggravating regional tensions in this of all countries. Combine that with the vast disparities in the number of voters per riding, and it takes as many votes to elect one Tory MP in some Alberta ridings as it takes to elect 5 Liberal MPs in PEI and Labrador. A system in which one person's vote is worth 3 times, or 4 times, or 5 times, or 26 times another's, depending on which party they vote for or which riding they live in, is, I submit, only approximately democratic. Indeed, for most voters, their votes are effectively worth nothing at all. If you vote for anyone, that is, but the winning candidate in our system, and that would be 50% plus of the voters in the last election, you are effectively denied representation. In a multi-candidate riding race, the winner might romp home with the support of less than 30% of the voters. The same trend is then aggregated over all of the ridings to produce quote-unquote majority governments with the support of less than 40% of the vote, who go on to claim 100% of the power. Worse still, of course, is the phenomenon of vote splitting. Under first past the post, voters are constantly told they cannot vote for the candidate they prefer, but must vote for some other candidate they dislike in order to prevent yet a third candidate they detest from winning. That's unless they live in a safe seat, which the geographic emphasis of first past the post tends to produce in large stretches of the country, which describe a great many ridings in our country. In those ridings, why does anybody bother voting at all? You know what the result's going to be. The fundamental promise and premise of democracy is one person, one vote. Everybody gets one vote, every vote is equal. That is simply not the case in Canada today, and may explain why so many Canadians refuse to indulge in the charade. But the worst effect of first past the post isn't even felt on election day, but every day in between. It's the incentives it creates for certain types of political behavior that really mark it out as a failed system, one that very, very few countries in the world still use. The most important thing to know about first past the post is that it is highly leveraged. That is to say, the parties, not only do the parties' representation in the legislature bear no resemblance to their respective shares of the popular vote, but tiny swings in the vote lead to exponentially larger swings in electoral outcomes. You get a 2% swing in the popular vote, you get 60 more seats. Finding and mobilizing these voters, the swing voters, is thus a matter of huge consequence to the parties. But of course, these are the voters paying least attention, the ones who make up their minds, as it were, at the checkout counter. So what do we get? We get long periods when no party takes any position at all for fear of alienating these voters, punctuated by wild frenzies where we dangle wedge issues in front of every passing voter. We call those elections. When a party needs only a small slice of the electorate to win, what is more, they have little incentive to make themselves less obnoxious to the rest. Indeed, they have every incentive to amp up the us and them rhetoric, the better to lock down their support, to gin up their supporters to get to the polls. So some of the viciousness of our politics can also be attributed to this perverse system. Is it any wonder that so few democratic countries still employ it? Well, unavoidably, after the election, Parliament returns. At which point most of us are moved to ask, why? What's the point? For that matter, so do many MPs. That's how irrelevant Parliament has become. What do we elect MPs to do? Examine legislation? Not when dozens of laws of vastly differing purpose can be bundled together into omnibus bills, hundreds of pages long, the whole of the government's fall agenda in one bill, leaving scant hours to study any individual piece. Worse, the business of supply, the fundamental prerogative of parliaments going back to Simon de Montfort, has broken down almost entirely, with MPs handed the estimates weeks before the budget, each document on a different accounting system, the figures broken out in a way that makes no sense to anybody. Well, maybe we want MPs to debate in Parliament. The arguments are rote, attendance is sparse, no one's mind has changed, hasn't been for 60 years. That's when debate is even permitted, and not, as has happened several dozen times in this session alone, curtailed by a government motion of time allocation. That's closure's politer cousin. Vote? Do we want MPs to vote in Parliament? Well, yeah, except that Canada has, experts agree, amongst the strictest systems of party discipline in the democratic, or I dare say the non-democratic world, affording individual MPs the least leeway to vote as their conscience or their constituents dictate. Not for nothing are MPs sometimes referred to as $160,000 voting machines. Or maybe we want them to propose legislation, to put bills forward in Parliament. Yeah, well, in a typical year, only a handful of private members' bills ever get into law. Not only must they survive the lottery they go through, but votes on private members' bills are increasingly whipped. Indeed, the Tories have been taken to using them as essentially proxies for government bills when they don't want to actually take responsibility for them as a government. Indeed, as we were reminded only last year, MPs cannot even ask questions in the House or make routine members' statements. I say that sentence again, members' statements, without the permission of the party whips. When they do, they're as often as not confined to reading out lines written for them by party communications staff. Indeed, if you watch Question Period, you have the utterly unedifying spectacle of MPs rising with questions that have been written for them by party communications staff. It's particularly poignant when you see this happening on the government side, where they ask a question written by the communications staff, and the minister gets up and reads an answer written by probably the same communications staffer. And my response to that is, can't we just cut out the middlemen? Let's just get the communications staffers in there. So that is an MP's lot, to do as they are told, speak as they are told, vote as they are told, to stand in their place when they're called upon, and to sit down after, to attack their opponents on cue and shout their support for the leader, often to the tune of a standing ovation. If you watch Parliament nowadays, if you really want to get the full third world impression, count the number of times that they jump to their feet for a standing ovation. It doesn't take, it used to take at least a witticism of some kind. Now every stray burp gets it. And the person I blame for this specifically is Joe Clark. When the Clark Tories came in 1979, it was right after television had come in, and they were very concerned that Mr. and Mrs. Canada were going to be very put out by seeing the MPs pounding the desks fine old Canadian tradition of desk thumping. And so they replaced it with this sort of pinky-pointing gentility of applause. And the problem with applause is it's subject to applause inflation. You know, merely applauding is not quite good enough after a while. You have to have somewhere, you know, higher. And now we're into, you know, standing ovations. I think eventually we're going to be into jumping ovations. And if you watch them, you can see they're all very nervous because the cameras are on them. And if everyone else is standing and jumping to their feet to applaud, do you want to be the MP who's caught not doing so? It's a largely ceremonial parliament, and that is one of the first cues of it. Parliament is simply not the place where important matters are debated, decided, or increasingly even announced. When a government minister wants to make a big announcement, no, he doesn't go to the place where he's supposed to be held accountable for his actions. He goes across the country to an auto dealer or what have you. In the Prime Minister's case, he announced an important change to old age security in Switzerland, of course. It has become a largely ceremonial body, a glorified electoral college. Well, how did it come to this? The answer lies not so much in the formal rules of the game as in the relative powers of the players. MPs are too weak in the main because their leaders are too strong. Without addressing that imbalance, nothing much will change. Simply allowing more free votes, which is what every would-be reformer always announces he's in favor of, would do little on its own. Free votes, as they stand, are never really truly free, let's be honest. The date when party leaders began to get the upper hand can be marked with some precision. It traces back to the 1919 Liberal National Convention that chose Mackenzie King as its leader. Previously, party leaders in Canada had been chosen, as they are in the classic Westminster model, still largely enforced in Australia, for example, by a vote of the caucus. As they were made, so they could be unmade. In such a system, even prime ministers can be removed by caucus at any time, as Margaret Thatcher was, as Australia's Kevin Rudd was, and as his successor Julia Gillard was in her turn. It's not hard to see how this would make a party leader rather more attentive to the concerns of ordinary MPs. By contrast, a leader in possession of a mandate from heaven, that is the membership at large, or in Justin Trudeau's case, by a vote of whoever happened to be in the neighborhood on the day, is free to thumb his nose at the caucus for long periods at a stretch. Now, in extraordinary cases, after much acrimony, by a system that nobody knows any of the rules, or it is true that a leader in our system can still be forced out by his MPs, but it's an incredibly complicated system where, as I say, you don't even know what the required percentage is. But the knowledge, even then, even if you can get your nerve up to do it, that this would precipitate not a quick sounding of caucus as in the British or Australian system, but a months-long leadership race at enormous expense to the party with all the divisions it leads to, et cetera, makes this the atom bomb of political threats, so awful as to be of little use. Whereas Thatcher was replaced in a matter of days. But that's only one side of the equation. If the leader dominates caucus, it's not only because they do not choose him or her, it is because he almost literally chooses them. In Canada, as a matter of law, and I think this is more or less unique in the democratic world, no candidate may run for parliament under a party banner without the signature of the leader on his nomination papers. This gives the leader an absolute veto over the nomination of every member of caucus, real or prospective, not just new candidates, but existing MPs, which means get out of line and you'll never work in this town again. Yet this is often defended even by MPs themselves. They ask, how could a leader be expected to put up with a candidate who was damaging the party's brand? It's like they're his employees. It's like they're working at the Gap, and they're worried about they didn't fold the shirts right because it's going to damage the company's brand. This is how fully they've absorbed their own subservience. Now, look, it's always possible that a riding association could nominate a candidate so abhorrent to the party that it would have no choice but to withdraw its imprimatur. But why should that be the sole prerogative of one person, the leader? Why not, for example, a vote of the other riding associations? Or why not, there's all kinds of models you could do within the party hierarchy that don't just give it all to the person at the top. Even if MPs did not need the leader's signature on their nomination papers, of course, they would still have ample reason to follow his dictates. Ambition is the real party whip, commanding obedience where mere threats might not. This is especially true on the government side, given the range of offices and favors that are in the Prime Minister's powers to bestow. In other countries, executive power is subject to various checks and balances, whereas whether in the formalized separation of powers that an American president must negotiate or the multi-party coalitions that are the norm in most European countries. Nothing of the same limits a Canadian Prime Minister, certainly one in possession of a majority. Prime Ministers in any Westminster system have always been powerful. That first among equals stuff was never really true. But ours have amassed powers that are quite without parallel. Let us consider the powers of appointment of a Canadian Prime Minister. He appoints the Governor General. He appoints the senators. He appoints every member of the Supreme Court and all the federal court judges too. He appoints the clerk of the Privy Council, every deputy minister, the governor of the Bank of Canada, the heads of all the major crown corporations. He appoints all the ambassadors. He appoints the chief of the RCMP. Those independent officers of Parliament, like the Auditor General, the Information, Privacy and Ethics Commissioners, he appoints them too. And he makes almost all of these appointments without any independent oversight of any kind. True, it is customary to consult on some of them, and there were some tentative steps in the direction of parliamentary review of Supreme Court appointments. We'll see whether that survives the latest brouhaha. And there was some talk that maybe someday we might have some different system for appointing senators, but that seems to have gone by the board. So the power to appoint all of these officials remains exclusively the purview of the Governor General and Council, which is to say, the Prime Minister. The choice is his and his alone. Most important, of course, he appoints the Cabinet. At 39 ministers, we have the largest cabinet in the democratic world. I've checked. Much larger than any comparable country. The President of the United States is able, this is the United States of America, is able to get by with a cabinet of just 15, plus 7 cabinet-level officers. All right. The Prime Minister of Japan or the Chancellor of Germany in the high teens. Britain, Australia, and New Zealand all have cabinets with fewer than 24 ministers. Why does Canada need nearly twice as many? Why, particularly when it wasn't always the case? Sir John A. Macdonald founded the country with 12, and as late as Louis Saint Laurent, there were still fewer than 20. Even Pierre Trudeau, at his worst excesses, I think only got up to 30. But somehow we're now up to 39. What does this mean? Well, given a typical majority governing caucus of between 160 and 180 MPs, and bearing in mind the probability of some ministers stepping down or being replaced in the life of a government, it means an MP on the government side, if he keeps his nose clean, has at least a 1 in 4 chance of making it to cabinet. Compare that to Britain, where with a caucus of more than 400, let's say, and a cabinet of 20-odd, your chances are more like 1 in 20. So you can see what happens. In the British system, there are lots and lots of MPs who are never going to make it to cabinet, and they know it. So they get up to useful mischief. They make themselves knowledgeable on a particular file. They become the dean of the House on this or that issue. They chair important committees. They have meaningful work outside of waiting in the Prime Minister's antechamber, hoping he'll make them a cabinet minister. Throw in the many parliamentary secretaries and committee chairs. Oh yeah, the Prime Minister appoints all of them too. And just about every member of caucus is in line for some sort of reward or thinks he is. And that's just the start. The Prime Minister alone decides, for example, when to dissolve Parliament and call fresh elections. Coupled with the power to declare any vote a matter of confidence, he effectively has a gun to the heads of any members on either side of the Commons who might be tempted to defeat a Parliament bill. Mind you, if government MPs are powerless, they are Caesars compared to the opposition in their desperate, futile attempt to hold the government to account. Hold the government to account. Have you watched Question Period? They can't get their questions answered when they ask them. Indeed, they can't get the documents they demand. And when they do, as we saw in the F-35 case, they can't trust the numbers in them. And on those rare occasions when a government is finally being held to account, when it really comes under close scrutiny, it prorogues for months at a time. Look, I mean, I get that there's nothing wrong with proroguing. It's an ancient and honorable part of our democratic parliamentary traditions. But even if you have some pretext to prorogue, there's no reason why you can't come back the next day. And yet what we're seeing is, and not just at the federal level, is governments proroguing and then running away for 6 months. We have provincial legislatures in this country that are sitting for 8 weeks in a year. That's not really a democracy. Does anyone care? Do we even notice? I don't know. But I know what you're thinking. There's still the confidence convention, the rock-solid baseline of our parliamentary system. Whatever else may have fallen by the wayside, a government must still command the support of a majority of parliament. Really. Tell it to Stephen Harper, who prorogued rather than face a confidence vote he was sure to lose. Tell it to Paul Martin, who lost a confidence vote, most constitutional scholars would agree, in 2005, then spent the next 9 days trawling the opposition benches, offering jobs and other inducements that were not constitutionally in his power to bestow in order to win a do-over. It's only a convention after all, you know, the confidence convention, like ministerial responsibility, like cabinet solidarity and the rest, just conventions. They held effect for as long as governments felt like being bound by them, and as they no longer do, they don't. So to recap, the party in the grip of a single leader and his coterie of advisors, though it offers little in the way of a serious platform and differs hardly at all with its main opposition, is nevertheless able by a combination of false promises, venomous attack ads, and fortuitous media blunders to stampede a little over a third of the electorate, 20% of the voting age population, into supporting it, which when processed through the vote splits and other tricks of the first past the post electoral system is magically transformed into a majority national government. Thus empowered, the Prime Minister rules with something approaching dictatorial powers until such time as he desires to repeat the process. And we wonder why 40% of the eligible voters don't show up. So, in my submission, we have something of a crisis on our hands. It's not only a crisis of legitimacy, it's in some ways an existential crisis when we're talking about national parliaments and national governments. With so few Canadians bothering to take part in national elections, it's debatable who the resulting parliament is answerable to or what it represents. The very notion of Canadians as a self-governing people is dissolving before our eyes. Well, how can we fix this? I only wish I could. I have a number of suggestions, which I'll run down in quick suggestions since they're unlikely ever to be implemented. And I'll start with the campaigns. And this question about political lying, which we've all been educated to think as, well, it's just part of the game. Why would you expect any different? The interesting thing is we don't accept that in other walks of life. If a company lies to consumers about its products, it faces stiff fines or worse. If it cheats its investors, well, I mean, a prospectus can't just not be false, it can't even be misleading. There are laws against libel and slander, and there are laws for those who fill out false information on welfare or immigration forms, all enacted by the same politicians who grant themselves license to tell worse lies to many more people. Even within the political world, there are provisions against lying in certain circumstances. Politicians are forbidden to lie to each other in Parliament, that's a strict no, or about each other, which is a provision in the election laws of Canada and 8 other provinces. But lie to the public about a major campaign promise, it's all part of the game. To be sure, free and feisty political debates are critical to democracy. Any proposals to police political speech, even to prevent out-and-out deception, should be viewed with great skepticism, as certainly they would be if applied to the media. The only known Canadian example, British Columbia's electoral fraud law, has avoided such a stifling effect mainly by being almost impossible to enforce. It requires complainants to demonstrate not only that the fraudulent promise affected the outcome of an election, but that they personally suffered damages as a result. But the problem remains, and as I said earlier, it's not so much that the liars are prospering as that honest politicians have no way of establishing their bona fides. So I'm not going to propose a blanket ban on political lying, which is a recipe for abuse, and certainly not something the parties are ever going to accept. But perhaps there might be a way, again, borrowing from private sector practices, to let politicians opt in to legal liability if the claims they are making prove to be false. We see this with bonded couriers, for example, or sworn affidavits, where people facing this very problem of how do I establish my bona fides have found ways to show to their customer satisfaction that they're trustworthy by willingly assuming certain penalties if they're not. So suppose there were a provision of the Elections Act which a candidate could invoke at his discretion to cover particular statements or documents, such as a platform, with provisions for fines or other sanctions if they're found to be materially false. There would be no gotchas over some stray slip of the lip on the campaign trail, but when they really needed to be believed, they'd have some means of persuading people that they were on the level. Such statements would no doubt be drafted with caution, as they are in private life, with conditions attached to cover different eventualities. We will balance the budget provided the economy grows by more than 2% annually, some sort of thing. Fine. Voters could decide how much weight to attach to them accordingly, as they could any declarations issued without such backing. I have a feeling that over time, opting in would become the norm rather than the exception. But there's an idea that I throw out there that we should maybe think about. Second, to deal with attack ads, I have a very simple solution. Make the leaders voice the ads. We've seen what they do in the States, where they have to come on at the end and say, I'm John McCain, I approve this message, and it's not really worked. I'd say we go one step further. What happens now, of course, is the leaders play a kind of a double game. They, most of them, will swan around being statesmanlike and saying, I have nothing but the finest view of my opponents, while their minions are doing the dirty work, flooding the airways with these ads accusing them of treachery or worse. If they had to voice them themselves, I mean, imagine, imagine, I'm going to pick on Stephen Harper for a second, but imagine Stephen Harper had to voice an ad saying, Michael Ignatieff, he didn't come back for you. It would end in a weekend. They would look so idiotic doing it. And I don't think it'd be any imposition on freedom of speech. You could say whatever terrible thing you wanted to about your opponents. You just have to own it. You'd have to fess up that this is me speaking. This isn't, Citizens for a Cleaner World or whoever these interest groups that set themselves up. Thirdly, cut their money. We don't need to spend anything like the amount that we're spending on election campaigns. It has never been cheaper. This is the oddity. It has never been cheaper to communicate with large numbers of people in human history, right? You can do so for essentially zero with email blasts and websites, et cetera. And there's, it's generally just, it's never been more cost-effective to communicate with large numbers of people. And yet we're spending more than we've ever spent on election campaigns. And we're spending it, what is more, mostly for things that hurt democracy. It's not for good stuff. It's for things like push polls and robocalls. And even when the robocalls are not actually illegal and fraudulent, they're still a pretty awful thing to do when you think about it. We've grown used to them. But this idea that you should be able, at will, to invade people's houses, albeit electronically, you're not actually coming in there with a megaphone, but it's the same thing. You're interrupting their dinner. You're flooding them with, you probably received dozens of these things during an election campaign. And what's most pernicious about it is, it's restored to the political parties what was taken away from them by the mass media, which is the ability to send one message to one group of voters and another message to another group, which politicians in this country, of course, regionally used to practice to perfection. It's harder to do now. But now with robocalling, this kind of micro-targeting, where they narrow it down to narrower and narrower slices depending upon your psychodemographic consumer profile, and they know all kinds of things about you as an individual. I don't know why we want to help that. I'm not saying we should, I would place some limits on it, but why we actually want to help it, why Elections Canada provides them with the election rolls to help them do that, why we give them so much money to spend on things like this. And never forget, most of what parties spend is public money one way or another, because they give themselves the most generous tax credits. You get a 75% tax credit for donating to a political party. You don't get nothing like that if you're supporting, let's say, curing cancer. You get, they may be fading out the per vote subsidy at the federal level, but there's so many ways in which they are now helping themselves at the public trough. I'm just saying it doesn't need to be anything like as expensive. The only reason they all feel they have to spend that much as they do is because the other parties are. It's like an arms race. If none of them could spend nearly as much money as they do now, fairness would be preserved between them, and we'd have much better election campaigns. Fourth, let's fix the debates system. And I propose this as an alternative to robocops and push polls and leaders' tours. Done right, I think debates could be an enormous contribution to our elections. What if we had a weekly debate through a course of a 5 or 6 week election campaign? We constructed the election campaign along a spine of debates. They don't have to all be leaders' debates. There could be finance critics' debates. There could be foreign affairs critics' debates. We could experiment with different formats. But the debates would assume a central importance in the campaign, which would mean we'd have to set the rules for them ahead of time. We'd have to entrench them, ideally, in the elections law. So we would, for those of you who know your roles, we would be doing it behind a veil of ignorance. Nobody would know where they were likely to be in the polls if we were setting the rules well in advance. So we might actually get something that was fair in terms of the rules. If nothing else, of course, what this would do is it would give the media something to do. The reason why we write such tripe is because we're trying to fill the news hole, and all we've got are photo ops and leaders' tours, et cetera. And so we get very distracted by whatever the latest controversy on Twitter was. That's now our means of choice of writing cheap news stories is, so-and-so was outraged on Twitter. Who cares? But if we had the debates to structure our coverage around, I think it would lead to better coverage as well. Fifth, I would put in a word here for mandatory voting. I'm not here to say that this would cure all of our ills. I understand that we want to do all kinds of things to give people positive reasons to vote. But in addition to that, as a bit of a nudge, I see nothing wrong with the idea of saying, we're all in this together. It's certainly, we've seen in countries that have it, it absolutely does work in terms of bringing turnout out. In Australia, when they brought it in, it went in one election from 58 to 96%, and it stayed above 90% ever since. What it does, in my view, is, what happens now is, it's not that the voters choose the parties so much as the parties choose the voters. The turnout has become the critical thing in elections, and turnout is driven by who it occurs to the parties to drive, literally or figuratively, to the polls. So as I say, they go through these exercises in micro-targeting you, and if need be, they will literally drive you to the polls. And there's certain categories of voters, you may have noticed, that don't have quite the same appeal to them, who don't, as it happens, turn out as often. And so we get a hugely unrepresentative sample of the voting public, the voting age public, that actually casts their votes. So from the standpoint of representativeness, if nothing else, it's a bit like the long-form census argument. I think there's a case to be made for this very small imposition on people's liberty. I know when I propose this, the first thing people do is they just suddenly discover the ancient and vitally important right not to vote. I promise you, in any system that has this, you can spoil your ballot, you can vote for none of the above, you can register your dissatisfaction, you just can't sit on your duff. And as time goes on, it's going to be, you just can't, all it's going to be required is leaning over to your computer and clicking. Or maybe at some point pressing your wrist. It's not that big of an imposition, I think, for the potential payoffs in terms of a more generally representative electorate. Sixth, proportional representation. I really won't bore you with that. I'm an agnostic on all the different models, but I just want a system where every vote counts equally, where every vote in every riding counts equally, where there's no more safe ridings, where there's no more need to split your vote or to vote strategically, where there's no more of this crazy winner-take-all system where if I can get 2% more in the popular vote, then I'll win the election. We associate in our country, in a lot of these debates, we associate proportional representation with instability. And of course, the first thing that comes to people's minds is Italy or Israel, which are two of the 100 and some odd countries in the world that use proportional representation. It's a bit like saying, I don't want to use that first past the post system because that's the system in Zimbabwe. There's lots of perfectly well-functioning systems, countries, that use proportional representation. We associate with instability because we associate minority parliaments with instability. Because why? Because everybody's got their hand over the trigger button. Because in our system, you get a 2% swing, off you go. If you knew that a 2% increase in your popular vote just means you win 3 more seats, there's no percentage in anybody provoking an election. You get much more, everybody calms down. You have much more stable multi-party coalitions. It's actually the beginning of real majority governments because you actually have to put together a coalition of parties that actually represent a majority of the citizens in the country and not, as we have now, 37%. Then there's a bundle of reforms for fixing Parliament. We just went through an exercise, sadly, of talking about changing those 2 things that I identified, abolishing the requirement for the leader's signature and letting the caucus choose the leader, as in the old system. We sort of went halfway there with the Reform Act, with Michael Chong's bill, which, if you were paying attention, was one of the major opportunities in the last couple of decades to begin to fix the system. And unfortunately, it kind of got eviscerated, which shows you what we're up against. That even a very mild reform, and he watered it down further as time went on, trying to win as many seats. The bill still exists, but it is, pretty weak beer at this point. So even this one opportunity they had where if all the MPs kind of moved together, they could maybe, loosen the constraints that the leaders of all parties put on them, and it died. And it died, let me stress, not because Stephen Harper just put the edict out, because all the party leaders did. That was an all-party leader marriage of convenience. So it shows you that this is not just a partisan thing. This is an all-party thing. Now, if we're going to ever move back to the system, as I would do, to have the caucus choose the leader, which is, after all, the basics of democracy is representation of, consent of the governed. What we have now is a party leader is chosen by one group of people, party members, or as I say, in the Liberal Party experiment, people somewhere, who, having voted, then disappear. That electoral assembly vanishes the minute it's finished its work. The leader then, I'm going to say figuratively, walks down the street, goes into Parliament, and announces to all the MPs, the people we elected, that you are now working for me. I am now your boss. You didn't have any choice in it, but I'm now your boss. And particularly when we see all the malevolent effects that has in terms of the rights and responsibilities of ordinary MPs, I do not know why we put up with this. And yet, when you start to talk about this, people say, well, that would be undemocratic. How dare that small coterie of MPs choose the leader? Because who the hell are MPs anyway? That's the underlying assumption, right? This shows how we get into these vicious circles, is if you think MPs don't really matter, that they're just some irrelevant side group, well, yeah, how dare they choose the leader? If you think the leader's job is basically to go out and fundraise and cross the country and be like a presidential candidate, if we live in a kind of a quasi-presidential system, then yeah, you'll be kind of persuaded that it should be chosen by, the membership at large or some other thing. If you think Parliament matters, if you think MPs matter, if you think the role of a party leader is to lead those MPs in this important place called Parliament, you might be a little bit more attuned to the idea that it should be the MPs who choose their leader. And you'd be particularly more open to that idea, I think, if we cleaned up the way that we choose MPs, if we cleaned up this local nomination madness that goes on in no country that I'm aware of in 2014, of buying memberships en masse and bussing in people who've got no connection with the party. So fix that, and maybe we'll get a bit more purchase for the idea that we should be going back to the classic Westminster system. But of course, change all these things, it doesn't make much difference so long as the ambitions of MPs are still such prominent things. So one of the things we need to do is to cut the size of the cabinet. There's no good reason that we need to have 39 MPs. We could cut a third of them overnight, and I promise you no one would notice the difference. We should limit the confidence motions. It doesn't have to be in the purview of just, again, one prime minister. Limit them to those explicitly designated as such by the mover. Subject the power to dissolve or prorogue to a vote of the House rather than just the Prime Minister's dictate. Give the Speaker more power. For example, rather than leave party leaders to decide who speaks when in Parliament, return that prerogative to the Speaker, as is the practice in the United Kingdom. We went some of that way in the recent Parliament, but there's still much work to do there. We might apply the same to motions to limit debate or to invoke closure. Again, surely that's a matter for the Speaker's judgment rather than the obvious self-interest of the Prime Minister. Maybe we should make it part of the Speaker's job, as we were debating recently, to decide on the relevance of answers in question period. You know, if you're making no even pretense of answering the question, maybe you should be called to account, as you are in other parliaments. There's any number of other reforms that would help to restore the balance of powers between the legislature and the executive, subjecting senior appointments to parliamentary review, having House committee chairs elected by the Commons, etc. But there's an obvious problem with all these suggestions that I've alluded to earlier. They require the Prime Minister's assent, or indeed the party leader's assent, to proceed. If they had any interest in limiting their own power, we would not be in the situation we are in. Were ordinary members to decide collectively that they were no longer willing to be treated in this demeaning way, no doubt they could force the issue. But that's not how they've been conditioned to behave. Each incursion on their prerogatives has habituated them to accept the next. Those of an independent bent are unlikely to be selected as nominees in the first place. If they do manage to make it through to Parliament, they face enormous pressures to be team players, not only from the leader, but from fellow caucus members. So, is it up to them? Well, I don't think we can count them. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think the experience when these reforms are put forward shows that. So, it's not going to be up to them. It's going to be up to us. Nothing will really change unless we, the voters, pay attention, unless we start to care. We've lived without a functioning Parliament for so long that it does not occur to us what we've lost or are losing. We have to look past the Parliament that is to the Parliament that could be. We have to see what a remarkable thing it is, this little playhouse where the life of the nation is acted out each day. We have to understand that this is our house and MPs are us. No other body represents all of us rather than just some of us, and as such, no other body can perform quite the same function as Parliament. Without it, the government would have a monopoly on the people's business. There would be no mechanism for forcing other issues and ideas onto the national agenda, nor any means of representing the particular interests and concerns of the people of each riding. It is at the same time the only forum in this God-forsaken country where all of our many regions and interests and identities are forced to reckon with each other, to balance their own needs against the rest. It is the only body to whom the government is constitutionally obliged to answer, not occasionally at its pleasure, but every day. It's what enables us to hold the government to account, not just at election time, but all the time. If we understood this more fully, that they are us, that this is where we debate the issues of the day, where we hold our government to account, where we decide what bills shall be passed, we'd be a lot less tolerant of seeing the people who represent us treated with such contempt, because it's we who are thereby insulted. But I've forgotten someone, haven't I? The media. Me, my kind. If ever MPs are to be released from the irons of party discipline, we journalists have to stop assisting their wardens. We have to stop running around as if the world were coming to an end every time an MP departs from the party line. The story there is not party divided. The story is MP does job. And who knows, maybe one day that will no longer be considered news. To save our democracy, we have to restore public faith in the political process. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It is broke. Let's fix it. Thank you very much.